Well, hijab is an ancient and actually profound institution. Sometimes we assume that it's just about the surface and doesn't affect what is within, but of course what we do to our outward does have an impact on what we're like within, just as our inward state will be very quickly discernible in terms of our body language, our behaviour, the kind of adab we have with others. So it is necessarily a profound institution. What it is in its essence is a kind of cautious celebration, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the world as an expression of His beauty and His goodness, and He has placed the greatest, most miraculous concentration of beauty in His creation, in the beauty of women. And every culture has always known that, and the artists and the poets have always celebrated that as being the most extraordinary manifestation of beauty, of Jamal, in Allah's creation. Of course, that is to be celebrated, but it's also the case that in the Semitic tradition in particular, not everybody has the right to gaze upon particularly intense concentrations of holiness. So in the ancient temple of Sayyidina Sulaiman in Jerusalem, the Holy of Holies was always covered by a veil. Similarly, in a Catholic church, the sacrament will often be in a little tabernacle that's covered by a veil. And similarly, in the context of Islam, you could say that the Kaaba is also veiled. The kiswa, the shroud over the Kaaba, is in a sense the hijab of the most spectacular symbol of the divine absoluteness and eternity that exists in this world. So the hijab really is not a sign that something is unworthy or impure or dangerous, rather it's an expression of the presence of holiness. And that generally is the way in which Muslims have responded to the miracle of beauty. So it is a way, as it were, of emphasizing the otherness, the apartness. So for instance, the word for women in Arabic is harim, but the word for our sanctuary in Mecca is the haram. It's a particular concept of an enclosure in which the sacred is manifested and displayed. That's something hard for us to understand in our civilization, because beauty is the thing that is least understood and is most commercialized. So the face of the woman, even though nobody knows that this is a manifestation of the divine creative power, it's a signpost to something higher, not an end in itself, is used and commercialized on the front cover of every magazine and every TV show, because people still have some dim sense that here is something transcendent. In the beauty of woman, there is a sign of transcendence. Even the most dead-hearted atheist still is inspired by that. But of course what they don't have is a way of setting that off and of sanctifying it and of demonstrating that it has to be in its due context. We wouldn't feel right if the Kaaba was unveiled. Certain sacred things are set around with barriers and liminal zones. And so it is with the miracle of female beauty, that in the context of Islam, our way of expressing reverence for it is to set it apart, to treat it with dignity, to surround it and the whole persona of women, particularly in public space, with actually quite severe regulations about deportment and modesty and self-effacement that again are not there to deny her, but to acknowledge the sometimes unruly power that the disclosure of beauty in the public space can bring about. I think it's not just a problem for women, it's a problem for men, and possibly even more for men, because it's harder for women, given their fitrah, to be taken away from the fitrah in an absolute way, because there's a certain way in which their embodiedness necessarily connects them to the world through childbirth, for instance. Men can get further away from their bodies, and you see that in teenage years in Western societies, that it tends to be male teenagers who are most ill at ease with themselves and often malfunction more significantly than the females, because they don't know what it is to be male any longer, whereas there's still an obvious function that is implicit in being female, which tends to centre young women to a considerable extent. Having said that, the modern workplace is really designed in order to inculcate us or initiate us into a civilization that does not recognise the good life, but rather recognises the managed pursuit of pleasures. There is no higher purpose of the modern world, unlike almost all traditional civilizations where everything existed thanks to a unifying principle, the pointed them towards the transcendent realm. Now we just exist in order to get more of the same, in order to compete, in order to be amused, to be entertained, and that means that there is no centering principle, and hence at the workplace in particular there is no opportunity for serenity, for calmness, for decompressing, and often people get into quite severe emotional and psychological, certainly spiritual states as a result. The first antidote to that is, of course, the prayer and scrupulousness in the prayer, because the prayer takes precedence over the meeting, the bus, whatever it might be. It's not negotiable. Secondly, we need to find ways, whether we're men or women, of sacralizing the working day. So, for instance, if you have a private habit, if I did something wrong, or I said something wasn't quite right, or I was lazy, I'm going to impose upon myself putting £1 in the sadaqah box that I keep on my desk, so that there's some sense of accountability in your own private working practices. A sense at the end of the day that you look back over the day's work to see whether your intention was right, whether you were operating in a correct and more adab and decent way with colleagues, whether you're wasting your time, wasting your employer's resources, and overall to see if you can turn all of those distracted things that you did during the day into parts of a whole, and the whole is to earn a halal income, to improve society, to support your family, and ultimately to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Without that unifying principle, our lives are going to be all over the place. Modesty is something that is innate. Human beings, even quite young children, very quickly develop a sense, even if they're never told, that it's wrong to be naked when people are looking. It's something that's natural to human beings. And that's been the case since the end of the paradisal era with Adam and Hawa. It's part of the fitrah. We're disconnected from the fitrah in the modern world. And there is, as a result, no real sense of how we can use this natural desire to be modest, to be self-contained, not to project ourselves physically in a way that's distracting to others. How we can use that fitri desire in a way that actually has a practical outcome. It's not just about body language and comportment and the kind of things that we can say and we can't say. It's something more profound. So coming into Islam from a non-Muslim background means, in a sense, that one has to relearn, in a sense, the art of being human. Modesty is a fundamental aspect of what we are. The modern world is very immodest, not just after the 9 o'clock watershed, but now everywhere. The great transformations that have happened thanks to liberations of various kinds in the last 50 years in the West have resulted in wall-to-wall obscenity by any traditional standard, and modesty is nowhere celebrated. But still, when people see it, they're impressed. I think most decent, non-prejudiced British people or American people, if they see a woman who is intelligently and modestly wearing hijab and living that hijab, there's something within them that is impressed by that. Not just because of the sacrifice that she's making, but because she is not part of the world in which everything is commercialized. So it can be, properly applied, a tremendous advertisement for Islam, and people who have had their interest in Islam sparked but just by seeing their hijab, and some part of their innate humanity being impressed by the radical turn back to human nature and to modesty and decency and values which the hijab represents. But of course it is difficult. Many people find it a struggle. But then religion is a struggle, and it's a sacrifice. Ibrahim was commanded to sacrifice his son. All of the prophets had to make vast sacrifices. Religion offers us paradise, and Allah says that the price of paradise is high, but Allah is merciful. So we rely on Allah's mercy because we can never pay the price of eternity. That would be an infinite price. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks for a few little things from us in order to give us the garden that goes on forever. That's because He provides بِغَيْرِ حِسَاب, without reckoning. But still, we have to make that sacrifice. There are certain sacrifices that men have to make. Sometimes if there's a war, the men have to carry the bulk of that responsibility. There are some things that women have primarily to do. That's just part of the way in which Allah has created us as two genders. But the path to paradise is necessarily steep, but we are promised in prophecy that it's worth it. There is no Quranic ayah or hadith that dictates what colour women's dress has to be. There are certain indications that women of the Sahaba generally would wear black or sometimes white, but it's certainly not a Sharia requirement in any consensual way. The concern is, of course, that the hijab, whose intention is to emphasize the essentially interior nature of womanhood, becomes another way of projecting oneself in the public square, which is what everybody does in the modern world. This is all about exploring yourself, expressing yourself, having a personality, being noticed. But that's not the Islamic way. The Holy Prophet said every religion has a particular quality or character. لِكُلِّ دِينٍ خُلُقٍ وَخُلُقُ الْإِسْلَامِ الْحَيَاءُ. And the character trait of Islam is haya, or modesty. This applies for men as well. It's not just about whether women should look interesting in public, but it's also affected equally how men are going to dress. If one is dressing in order to attract people's attention or to project oneself or whatever, then there is a moral problem there. And we have to face the fact that human beings do like to dress up, and it's a very strong impulse that we have. And if the hijab is about overcoming that and stressing the spiritual miracle of the face and the emphasis on public decorum, sending out an important moral message, but then there's an ambiguity because her trousers are tight and she's perfumed and she's got lipstick and she kind of looks as if she'd like to be friends with somebody. There's a real paradox there, and non-Muslims will be the first to spot it. They're the first ones to laugh at the girl who wears the tight hijab, which is wearing the tight jeans and kind of sitting on the table in the classroom and chatting to the boys. That's obviously absurd. That's the worst of both worlds. So the most important thing is, once the basic Sharia requirement, everything but the face and hands has been observed, is to watch her body language, to watch her intention, to think about exactly why she wants to wear a certain thing, and to be aware that the shaitan flows in the descendants of Adam along with the blood, as the hadith says, and we're very good at deceiving ourselves. It depends on their aptitude. Some people are very good at da'wah and want to join parent groups and talk to everybody about Islam, and very extroverted and will use every opportunity to do da'wah, so that when the cold caller comes from Bangalore selling you double glazing, you respond by telling him about Islam. There's all kinds of ways in which, even if you're at home, you can engage in da'wah activities if you have that kind of personality. The essential responsibility everybody has is, if we are sorted out inside, then good things, inshallah, will happen for others anyway. Even if we seem to be not doing very much in the community, but we're involved in dhikr and Quran and looking to our children and doing our own thing, but we're concerned to get it right, that will have a big impact on people who are kind of observing us and people who are mixing with our children. And so, Ibda biman ta'ul is the prophetic commandment. Begin with your dependents. Yourself, make sure you're all right, family, spouse, children, extended family, parents, grandparents, and then on. But you start with the family, because the family unit is fundamental in Islam. Sometimes we tend to be so preoccupied with the far horizons that we forget what's happening around us. And a lot of da'wah-oriented Muslims, sometimes including myself, tend to have that issue. But the prophetic commandment is clear. We know how much time he spent at home, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. One of the toughest aspects of the sunnah for many Muslim families is the fact that the Holy Prophet did a lot of housework. Not just because it's out of humility, but also because it's a way of being at home, being integrated into the give and take of family life, and that's very important. As often happens, and is probably not unhealthy, there are different opinions on that. The preference is, of course, for there to be no physical contact, and if one can engineer that situation, then that's better. What some rabbinical Jews do, for instance, is to wear a very light glove that you can hardly notice if they go to a big reception, I was at a reception recently in London, and there was a very conservative Orthodox rabbi there. He was shaking everybody's hands, including the women, happily, but when I shook his hand, I saw there was something there. I don't think anybody really noticed. It wasn't much of a problem. That's an option that can be considered seriously. Otherwise, we try to...
Because it does seem a bit rude when it's sort of in your face, unless you can pretend to keep yourself occupied.
But there's
with something.
a limit to how many concessions we can make for the sake of politeness.
Yeah.
What if somebody wants to kiss you on both cheeks every morning when you come into the office? You can go on. There's an excessive familiarity based on the fact that this is a culture where boundaries are confused. And we do have, alhamdulillah, in the Sharia, clear boundaries, and that protects us. The Sharia is only there to protect us from the rubbish that we do if left to our own devices. So, if in doubt, if one possibly can, err on the side of caution. Sometimes it's difficult. Allah is forgiving, but ultimately, I think it's an individual's judgment call rather than a matter on which we can expect unanimous fatwa from the jurists. Too much concern for the opinions of others is natural and is human, but it's not really the religious way. The religious way is to be prepared to face criticism and just put up with it. If one knows that one is following a correct fatwa, one is doing what is right, you just smile and say, thank you brother, thank you sister, mashallah, we all have so much to learn, and don't get into a dispute about it. Sometimes just play dumb. That's what I often do. If I'm in a mosque and somebody thinks that I'm praying facing the wrong qibla or something, he comes up to me in outrage. I just say, oh, thank you, brother, thank you so much. I didn't know very much. I'm new in Islam. I have so much to learn. And that satisfies them, and it's courteous, and they go on. And it doesn't create a situation, but to say, no, so Sheikh so-and-so says X, and Sheikh so-and-so says Y, and I know this text, turns it into a disputatious matter, which really shouldn't happen in the masajid. So it's an exercise in humility. People criticizing you say, oh, I didn't know very much. Astaghfirullah, thank you so much, sister, and just move on. And inshallah, they'll accept that. But Islam is not about being concerned ultimately with the opinions of people on either side, because Allah is the only judge. And it's our responsibility before Him to ensure that we are following a valid interpretation of His law. And once we're doing that, we have that yaqeen, and our sheikhs are comfortable with the fatwa that we're following. The chit-chat is just something we can be forgiving towards. Islam is based on the beauty of God's law. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ennobled humanity above everything else in creation. Karramna bani Adam. Human beings are more dignified, they have the capacity to know right from wrong, they have more physical beauty, they have intellectual beauty, they can submit to Allah. These are the beings to whom even the angels could prostrate. That which ennobles us maximally is not following what we feel like doing in a particular moment, but conforming to what the Lord of Heaven wishes us to do. And part of Allah's generosity is that He's given us a sharia with a lot of detail, because our lives have a lot of details. We're in dunya, which is complicated every day. There's dozens of different issues. And at every moment, the believer says, either I can do what I feel like doing, which is the nafs, the ego, slothful pride, showing off, whatever it might be, or I can conform myself to the sunnah of the chosen one, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So every little fiqh issue, even if it seems to be small, trivial, even if we don't understand why it's there, is a spiritual opportunity to turn away from the ego and towards the spirit. Once we have that sense, that the sharia and the sunnah are spiritual exercises turning us into noble, self-contained, dignified, calm, happy human beings, rather than just a whole bunch of commandments and prohibitions, which is often how it's projected to us, unfortunately. Once we see it as a spiritual method and a way of re-centering ourselves in a crazy world, then the last thing we want to do is take the hijab off or make concessions with whatever, as if the sharia is not Allah's attempt to make things difficult for us. The nafs, the shaitan, want us to have a hard time. And if you really follow the nafs, you have a really hard time in your life. That's guaranteed. Allah wishes to protect us from that. He's calling us to the abode of peace, to salvation. And his method, the unique method for that, is his sharia, and all of it is mercy. Everything that keeps us away from our own rubbish is mercy. And we need to see the sharia as that. And the easiest way of seeing that, and that's really the secret of getting Islam right, really living Islam and loving Islam, is to see the sunnah beautifully practiced by a really saintly human being. When you see the sunnah not as just a bunch of rules that somebody's looked up and is doing and imposing on himself while the ego is rebelling, but to see the complete submission, loving submission of a human soul, body and mind in the way of the chosen one, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. That's where you see the beauty of Islam, where it's actually implemented in somebody who's really living it. Once we have somebody like that in our life, then of course, what else do we want to do but follow the sunnah?
So keeping good company, really. Then.
Keeping the company of the best people we can find, that makes everything much easier. Imam al-Ghazali has books on fiqh, where he talks in the usual Shafi'i terms about the boundaries of what's permissible in terms of the mingling of the sexes and female dress. There's no surprises there. He's an orthodox Shafi'i jurist, and these are essentially fiqh issues. In terms of a profound understanding of gender and what gender means, which is in our homogenizing world where increasingly men and women have the same responsibilities and jobs and expectations, and gender's almost been opposed as a principle, which is incredibly impoverishing. When we need to reaffirm that and discover what is it to be a man, what is it to be a woman, how can I inhabit that reality which Allah has bestowed upon me. Imam al-Ghazali is probably not the first port of call for texts such as that, for issues such as that. There are other authors who've written on it. The Japanese writer Sachiko Murata has a very interesting book on gender relations in Islam, the Tao of Islam, which is good because it basically is just a huge anthology of what classical scholars have said about the meaning of gender. Actually a very beautiful book. Not everything in it has to be followed, of course. But,
is it available in English?
It's in English, yeah, she wrote it in English, the Tao of Islam. So that probably is a more appropriate place to begin rather than looking at the works of Imam al-Ghazali, who doesn't factor gender into his metaphysics very much, as some of the scholars